As I was introduced, and as you'd appreciate from my accent, I am an Australian, now based here in Singapore, been living permanently in Singapore for all of 5 months in this wonderful city, moved here from Brisbane, Australia. My company in Australia is a company called Urbis, and we're Australia's largest private property economics, urban planning, urban design and property valuation business, with some 600 staff in offices in Brisbane, Gold Coast, Sydney, Melbourne and Perth. We have worked in Australia on most of the major development and investment projects around Australia, and particularly over the last 10 years we've also been doing a lot of work in Asia, in China, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Japan. And in Australia we are working, about 40% of our work in Australia is working for the major developers from Asia, working on major projects in Australian cities. So this year we set up a permanent international company called Cistri, and you can go online and find out about our companies, but our company Cistri is wholly owned by Urbis Australia, and I'm the regional director of Cistri, now based here in Singapore, living here, but we are wholly owned by Urbis Australia, and as I said, we're an independent company and the largest of its type in Australia. My background, my undergraduate degree is in economics and my master's is in urban planning, and I've worked for the last 35 years in Asia, Europe, North America, the Middle East and Australia on development projects, on the economics and feasibilities of property development projects. So I've been involved in this sector for a long time. So I'm pleased to be here today to give you an overview of the economic conditions which impact on the Australian property sector. You're here obviously because you have an interest in property and investment, and you're here because you're people who probably like to have knowledge and information. So I'm going to give you a background as to what's happening in Australia in terms of the economy, because as you would all know, astute property investment is about knowing the real situation and having a long-term perspective. And I also appreciate that many Singaporeans and many people from this region of Asia have a very good knowledge of Australia. Obviously there's a very close relationship between Australia and the region. Many of you have probably visited Australia on many occasions, have family, friends living there, or have relations or people who have come to this region. So there is a close relationship. So I know there is already a very good knowledge. So I apologise if I'm going over some information that you're aware of. But I think it is interesting to look at some of the basic fundamentals that underpin the Australian economy. One of the strong factors about the Australian economy, Australia, like Singapore, is obviously a developed economy. And we have here a chart over the last 20 years of the quarterly, so this is a quarterly change of gross domestic product, so the impact on growth. So when people talk about GDP growth, you hear talk about figures 1, 2, 3 and 4%. It's very topical in Singapore at the moment because obviously the government is concerned here that economic growth is a little bit lower than Singapore is used to, and it's running at around less than 2% per annum on their current forecast. The great thing about Australia is that of the developed economies in the world, over the last 20 years, Australia is the only economy that hasn't experienced a technical recession. And a technical recession is where you have 2 quarters of negative economic growth. And this is the thing that the Singapore government is a little bit concerned about now, that there may be 2 negative quarters. But in Australia, even through the GFC, Australia did not have 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, and indeed it bounced back very strongly. So Australia consistently has had economic growth running between the 3 and 5%. And when a developed economy sustains economic growth between 3 to 5%, it means that it's building its economy. Effectively, it's in the capacity to double its economy over every 25 to 30 years. So it's a very strong fundamental basis. And Australia benefits because it has a diversified economy. Whilst we have a very strong resource sector that you be aware of, The economy is diversifying further in terms of its rural sectors, but also in other areas of education, medical, financial services, technology. So Australia is forecast to continue to have this growth beyond 3% through to 2018. So a solid period, and the stability of the Australian economic basis is one of the factors that looks to a lot of the major fund managers in the world. So when I've been in meetings in New York or London or Berlin, when you're talking to the major fund managers of many of the big pension funds around the world, the reason they are interested in Australia is because it has this consistency and the stability that it experiences. So Australian GDP is forecast to continue to grow through to 2018-19 at 3%, and potentially it may even exceed that. So that may be a relatively conservative forecast by the Australian Treasury. The other interesting thing is that whilst our regional and our resource sector and our rural sectors contribute a lot, the mean or the impact of the growth and the stability of the economy is particularly felt in our major cities. So when you look into Australia, the percentage of GDP, you can see that Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth are all significant contributors to the strength of the Australian economy. So Australia, and I'll show some figures in a minute about the population base, and when I talk about Brisbane here, this is really Greater Brisbane, which is Brisbane and the Gold Coast region, because Brisbane really is a conurbation from Gold Coast, Brisbane and Sunshine Coast. But you can see that Brisbane and Perth, in the period of the growth in the 2000s, has contributed nearly 15% each of the gross domestic product. So our cities in Australia, and Australia is a very urbanised nation, and our cities are really where the power of the generation of a GDP happens. The mining and the rural sectors put the product out, but the funds come back into the cities where the financial sectors, the tertiary sectors really drive the growth. So our cities are very strong engine rooms for the Australian economy. The other factor to consider in terms of real GDP growth, and this is just a chart. So Australia is the blue line there. And you can see that compared to other countries like the UK, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, the USA, Australia is the least volatile. So the blue is the most consistent. And that is the key factor, as I've just been going through, in terms of driving this interest in investment in Australia. When the GFC hit, Australia didn't go down into that dip. It showed its resilience and was able to continue to grow forward. So Australia is a stable economy with long growth prospects. Interest rates, as we all know, interest rates have consistently been down, and they're down at a low rate now. So we're in an interest rate period, and the outlook is that interest rates should stay in a relatively low sector, below that 10%. As I said, the 10-year average there was 6.8% interest rates. The last few years have obviously been significantly below that. The other thing about economies, and obviously very importantly when you're looking at property investment, there are three things that drive successful property investment: population growth, economic growth and job growth, and then infrastructure growth, which is driving the development of an area. Australia has also been able to maintain its national unemployment below 6%, and its national unemployment is forecast to be well below 6%, around 5.5%. That's as a nation, and our capital cities have lower unemployment rates than that. So in developed economies, and I know in Singapore the unemployment rate is similarly a strong, below that 6%. But as you would all know, there are developed nations around the world that have experienced unemployment rates sitting 7% and above, which puts real pressure on your economy. But Australia has been able to maintain its unemployment rate below that 6%, and the outlook is looking quite strong. Once again, compared to the other nations, the other developed countries, Australia, once again, the blue line here, you can see that our unemployment rate compared to the USA, compared to Canada, compared to Japan, New Zealand, has been consistently below those. So it is a more stable economy across its unemployment as well as its GDP growth. And the trend across the country, so this shows New South Wales, Victoria, you can see that there's a little bit of variation, but across the areas, they still tend to stay around the same. So when people say that the Western Australian economy might be struggling because of unemployment, unemployment has risen in Perth, which is to be expected, but once again, the rate is not beyond that of the other states significantly. So Australia has a consistent capacity to maintain its employment. Obviously, living here in Singapore, you are all in part of what is one of the best planned cities in the world. And obviously, Singapore is held up as a case study to many parts of the world in terms of how you develop very successful urban areas. One of the other things that is also exemplified in Australia, and one of the things I want to highlight today, is that in our major cities, like Singapore, our major cities are subject to very intensive and very productive good planning strategies. So people are always looking to how we make our cities better. And you'd be aware that the Australian major cities, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide, are always rated as amongst the most livable and the best cities in the world to live. But importantly, the planning regimes and the governments, both at federal, state and local government, are always looking to make them even better. So this is why when people look into Australian investment, they see cities where people are always trying to make them better. The reason our cities are changing is for a number of reasons. There are growth pressures, and I mentioned before that one of the things you look for when you're looking for areas of productive investment is population growth, and our Australian cities are experiencing population growth, so our governments are looking to how they manage that better. We're looking at urban renewal. We're looking now, some of our cities, Australia is a relatively young nation, only some 200 years old in terms of world context, but that means that some of our cities now have areas where people are going in which were previously industrial areas, are now being redeveloped for residential, for mixed-use areas. So there's a lot of good inner city development happening. We're looking at how we do our density better, how we make sure we don't get too much congestion, how we look at our affordability in terms of providing the product. And I'm sure when you look at some of the pricing of what real estate is in Australia compared to some of the pricing here in Singapore or regionally, the relative value component is something that the Australian government and the major governments are looking to try and maintain so that they keep the affordability there. So our cities are changing, and these are issues that people are dealing with. So each of our major cities have major planning strategies happening. So in Sydney, there's a lot of focus on the Central Sydney planning strategy. Melbourne has its 270 plan. Perth is looking at some very significant catalytic projects that are changing the CBD and the intensity of Perth. Brisbane has a very forward-looking city centre master plan. The Gold Coast has recently, in the last 2 years, put out a very forward-looking plan to guide the future development of that beautiful area of the Gold Coast. So each of our major cities is looking at how it even gets better. So they're not sitting back and saying, well, this is as good as it gets. They're saying that we want to make these cities even better. So I'll just focus on some of the cities. Sydney, the Central City Planning Strategy, is looking at how it develops its commercial areas, how it keeps its residential capacity in the area, how it integrates mixed use, how it provides tall towers in this commercial area, flexible floor space, design excellence, higher environmental considerations. So Sydney is truly a world city, and they're trying to make it an even better city. Melbourne, similarly, is looking at how it protects its livability. Melbourne is often rated the most livable city in the world. Those of us who come from Brisbane or Perth or other places may dispute that, but it is a wonderful city, no doubt about that. It is a great place, but they want to make it even better. They're looking at how they protect spaces, make the public spaces better, how they get the right impact in terms of value uplift from its city. Brisbane, as I said, has put out a a major city centre master plan to guide its development. It's looking at how it designs its buildings to make our architecture even better, how to reflect the subtropical architecture. And architectural firms like Woha, who are very well known here in Singapore for their great buildings, Woha have designed the most recent major apartment buildings in Brisbane as well. And so Brisbane is looking at how it gets its better. Gold Coast, as I mentioned before, is looking how it looks at redevelopment of urban centres, how it gets the height into its area, development of health, knowledge and education precincts to make it even more attractive for employment, how it improves even further its architectural and urban design excellence. And Perth is undertaking some quite transformational projects in its infrastructure investment, redeveloping a major stadium close to the CBD, doing the world-class Elizabeth Quay project and putting underground some of its major transport infrastructure to create the CityLink project. So all of these cities are looking at how they improve their base activities. And they're able to do that because it goes back to that point I made before about the consistent gross domestic product growth. So they have the funds, like all governments, they always say they never have enough money, but they are able to put money forward combined with the private sector to look at some of these opportunities. The other thing that Australian cities are doing is looking at their infrastructure investment, because we all know that you can have a lot of population growth, and there are cities around the world, and many of the cities in some of the African, South American and even the Asian areas here, you know, those of you who travel to Jakarta or to Bangkok know that if the infrastructure lags too far behind, then the cities face problems in terms of congestion, accessibility and movement. So Australian cities are very focused on making sure that their infrastructure is put in place. So New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria and Western Australia get significant funding. This is just in the last financial year budget, 5.7 billion of just federal funding to go out. That's topped up by state government and then private sector. So New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia. So it's being spread around the nation. In Melbourne, there's a Docklands precinct which has been developed over the last 15 years to go forward, 17.5 billion. Melbourne Metro is putting in place a major metro scheme, $9 billion currently under construction. The Western Distributor, another 5.5 billion, all trying to make sure that the city keeps moving and improves the accessibility. Perth, as I said, the Elizabeth Quay, a $2.6 billion 15-year project. Perth Stadium, a $1.5 billion. The Forestdale Airport link, $2 billion. So Perth as a city continues to look at its transport infrastructure, its civic infrastructure, and improving itself all the time. Sydney, Barangaroo, those of you who've been to Sydney recently would see the Barangaroo project, you know, in the CBD area, 7.3 billion Lend-Lease project. That's Lend-Lease who are doing the $3.2 billion Paya Lebar project here in Singapore. So they're doing the Barangaroo project. The North West Rail link in Sydney, a $9 billion project. Darling Square, $500 million. In Brisbane, we've got the $3 billion Queen's Wharf precinct, which is ready under planning at the moment. The development between Star of Australia, Far East out of Hong Kong, Chow Tak Fook out of China, doing a major integrated resort there, almost modelled on the Marina Bay model. Howard Smith Wharves, another $100 million project. A $10 billion Trans-Apex master plan, which is just about complete now, providing underground tunnel systems linking the major areas of Brisbane. Gold Coast, light rail stages, that should be 2.2 billion, not 2.2 million. So the second stage of a Gold Coast light rail, those of you who have been to Gold Coast recently may have travelled on the light rail from Broadbeach up to Southport. The Commonwealth Games coming to Gold Coast, the Gold Coast Airport redevelopment, already now a major airport hub and international hub in Australia as well. So infrastructure is being invested into our cities. The reason why infrastructure is being invested into our cities is that Australia is really an urban nation. Whilst Australia is very fortunate that it is a huge landmass, the reality is that it's over 90% now of Australians live in cities. And our major cities, we have Singapore here of around 5.4 million people. In Australia, we have two cities of around a similar sort of scale. Sydney, 4.9. If you take up Newcastle, Whyalla, it gets close to around 5.5 to 6. Greater Melbourne, 4.5. Go around to Geelong, and that is around 5.2 million people. Brisbane, Gold Coast, if you add Brisbane and Gold Coast, about 2.8 million. Go up to Sunshine Coast, it's about a 3 million conurbation. Perth is already a 2 million sort of people city. So Australia is a 23.7 million nation now. The other significant thing about Australia is that Australia is going to grow to a nation of at least 35 million and potentially 50 million people by the year 2060. Australia is a growth nation. It is not capping its population. It has realised that the future of its stability, the future of its economic growth is to grow and to grow significantly. So the cities of Australia, this is the forecast through to 2061. Greater Sydney, which I said there before was sitting around the 4.5, is forecast to grow to nearly a 9 million people conurbation by 2061 and to be up to around 7.5 million by 2040. Greater Melbourne, almost the same size as Greater Sydney, a conurbation of some 9 million people. Greater Perth, some people think that Perth has probably reached its growth point, but the reality is that Perth is going to continue to grow. It has now built a population base, an economic base, that Perth is forecast to grow to a greater conurbation of around 4 million people by around 2031 and up to around 5.6 million people by 2061. Brisbane of a similar scale, and if you add Gold Coast as well, Brisbane will be up there around the 6 million. So Adelaide and Canberra, we have some other wonderful cities in Australia, beautiful places to visit, nice places to live, but obviously these are the growth centres of Australia, those cities that are really going to grow. And the Australian government, you sometimes may hear talk that there's concerns about how Australia is going to grow, but Australia has the capacity to accommodate this population. That's why our planning strategies for our cities are so important, why our infrastructure investment is so important. And the reason why Australia will continue to grow is because it has built a population base. Like many countries of the world, we do have an ageing demographic. The baby boomers are ageing through. But what Australia does have, it has a base level of at least 200,000 new immigrants into Australia each year coming from other parts of the world. Significantly, in the last 2 decades, the majority coming from Asia, who are now coming into Australia. That figure ranges between 200,000 to 300,000 per annum. Of that figure, the biggest age group coming in is the 25 to 35 age group. So that's the age group where people are coming in, they're forming families, they're adding to the population base. So if Australia continues to bring its immigration base in of that 200 to 300,000 per annum over the next 20 years, that is going to provide the base to continue off our existing base. It'll continue to grow. And Australia is a very successful multicultural society. Obviously, those of you who visit our cities realise that our cities are probably the most successful multicultural, along with Singapore, in the world. Vancouver and Toronto as well. But Australian cities are very multicultural, successful multicultural cities. They are going to continue to grow because of that basis. With that population growth is driving housing demand. So when you have population growth, you have a demand for dwellings. This chart's a little bit busy, but what it's showing is that this is the 6-month dwelling approvals in these cities. So in Sydney, on average, this is through to July 16. So in July 16, Sydney City approved just under 6,000 dwellings in a half year, so around 12,000 new dwellings just in Sydney. You can see Melbourne's at a similar line. Brisbane and Perth down here have been adding around 4,000 per annum, 2,000 a half year 4,000 per annum. That's dropped off in Perth and Brisbane. The economies have steadied. Those economies were growing around 7 to 8%. They couldn't maintain that, and as the resource sector steadied, it had to come off. So this was to be expected. Economic commentators knew that Perth and Brisbane wouldn't maintain, but they're still adding dwellings. There's still a demand happening in those areas, so they will still be adding around 2 to 4,000 per annum. Melbourne and Sydney are adding around 8 to 10,000 per annum. So the population growth is driving housing demand. Our major cities do not have enough dwellings to accommodate the population growth that is happening into these cities. The other significant factor is that with the growth of our cities, the availability of greenfield land or land to build houses. A lot of Australian cities started from detached houses, so separate houses on individual blocks of land. And if you visit our cities, you would have seen that. The reality is that outside of Melbourne and some areas of Perth, in Sydney and Brisbane, there's not a lot of greenfield land or vacant land ready for development or available for development. So Australian cities are moving towards developing more apartments. Where land is available for development, it's becoming increasingly rare, so it's very good if you can get hold of developments that have land. But Australians are becoming more accustomed to living and wanting to live in apartments. So the medium density approvals in our capital cities now, so you can see that of the approvals in the year to date in Sydney, so Sydney had approvals of nearly 50,000, about 35 of those approvals were for apartments. Similarly in Melbourne, in Perth has had some more available land available, but it's still building its apartment base. Brisbane, land available for development is becoming very scarce, so apartments are becoming a more accepted form of development. That's also a reflection of changing demographics. The younger demographic, the 25 to 35 age group, both those who have raised in Australia, those who are moving there, it's more common for them now to accept that apartments are going to be a preferred or a viable option for living. And many will see that as their future. So the Australian dream of having a detached house on a piece of land is still a desirable outcome, but more and more accepting that apartments for renting or places to live will be their longer term acceptance. And obviously Singapore has been a very successful example of how you develop a very successful city with high quality, good, higher density development. But that is a factor now in Australia. What's been happening in the residential market? In affordability terms, this is the Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth. Sydney, and you would have seen many comments on this, Sydney residential product has increasingly become expensive. Sydney is a world city. World cities, price, the demand for a product becomes increasing, so there's a pressure to increase the price. So Sydney now has seen its pricing go up. Melbourne has also experienced an increase, not to the same extent as Sydney. But Brisbane and Perth, the reason why Brisbane and Perth have been reasonably attractive in the investment market in Australia is because their affordability in terms of what available product, the pricing in Sydney and Melbourne. Now, that's not to say Sydney and Melbourne aren't very good markets and opportunities, but prying into those markets, there's a higher entry point into those markets. The markets demand a higher point. So Brisbane and Perth have a lower entry point. This is the comparisons in terms of the median price. So this is the median price across all apartments sold in these cities over these years. And you can see that Sydney, so that's the median price, the midpoint of all pricings have sold. So you can see that Sydney has experienced significant uplift in its median price. Melbourne also gone up. Then you've got Brisbane, Perth and the Gold Coast down here significantly below Sydney. So the affordability figure for the Gold Coast, Brisbane, Perth and Melbourne is less than Sydney. Having said that, growth rates across the markets. So these are growth rates between houses on the left and units. So you can see that in Brisbane, over 10 years, the average growth in sale price of houses has been 5.1% year on year in Brisbane. Melbourne at 2.5, Sydney 6.2, Perth 3, Gold Coast 3. So that's a 10-year across the market. Unit prices, Brisbane 3.1% per annum, Melbourne 4.6%, Sydney 6%, Perth 1.7%, impacted by the last few years, and Gold Coast around 1.5%. The proportion of dwelling approvals that are apartments, this is just reflecting that earlier trend I'd mentioned there before. So in Sydney, all of our cities are showing that apartments are the greater percentage, or have reached a higher point of approvals. Here nearly 60%, 50%, around the 30%, and as I said, Perth, the one that's had some more greenfield land, a little bit less than that, around the 20%. So apartments are an increasing sector of the Australian residential market. With that stock coming on, and the concern that is expressed by some people about the vacancy factor, this is from some survey research that we've done along with the real estate institutes in the various states. And you can see that from 2011-2016, the Perth market has shown an increase in terms of vacancy. That is a reflection of what's happened with the resource sector. But that vacancy rate is 6%. It's not 10, 15%. It has increased. You can see it was a very tight market in Perth at the peak of the boom. It softened a little bit at the 6%, but that market will sort of taper again. You can see that in the other cities, the vacancy, so this is of all apartments that are available for rent, the vacancy levels in the other cities are below 3%, and in the Gold Coast here, it's at 1.4 and Sydney 1.8. So very tight market. So those apartments that are available for rent are being occupied by and large. Some of those vacancies also reflect people who don't necessarily want their apartment to be rented. In terms of foreign investment, Sydney and Melbourne have been very hot markets, and that's why the prices have driven up. So Sydney and Melbourne have been attracting a lot of the investment, but I think now there's more interest in looking at what some of the other areas, the Queensland, the Western Australia. So the 4 states that really attract it, South Australia and Canberra, ACT, do attract investment, but obviously not at the scale that's happening there. That also reflects a lot of the commercial investment that's happening. I'll very just quickly go through, and I know the main interest here is most probably in residential, but when you're looking at an economy, you just don't want to look at one sector in residential. So you want to say, well, that might be okay. The residential sector looks pretty active, but what's happening in the retail and commercial sectors in Australia? So similar to the gross domestic product figures, across Australia, the retail annual growth is showing solid growth are up above the 2%. In New South Wales and Victoria, very strong retail growth. South Australia, Queensland, Western Australia. So even in Queensland and Western Australia, where the economies have come off the very strong resource growth, there's still been retail growth above 2.5, 2.8 and 2.3%. So the retail sector is still growing. So people are still spending. There's growth happening across that sector. Transactions, there have been a significant demand, both domestically but internationally. Many of the big investment funds around the world are buying into Australian retail centres because they know that there's going to be population growth. They know the cities are going to continue to develop, so they're looking at investing into Australian retail centres. And the yields have been very tight. I won't go through all these, but the regional and sub-regional shopping centres in Australia have been selling on yields below 5%, which for developing or a developed economy are still strong economies. Office growth, similarly, Australian commercial sector is growing. So we're adding additional stock, some 25,000 square metre or dollar value, 25 million on a year-on-year basis across the area. So we're adding stock. It's being occupied, so the vacancy levels are quite low. So even in Brisbane and Perth, where the market has experienced, some softening, the vacancy levels are still a smaller proportion, 10 or 12%, but our commercial market is still being occupied. Vacancy rates there have increased, but still being occupied. So there are challenges and opportunities. So the picture I've painted, I've got 10 minutes to go, so I might even finish a little bit early, but what I've tried to show is the base economic underpinning of Australia in terms of GDP growth is still happening, will still continue to happen. The challenges that are going forward, in our cities, it's getting that balance between how much residential is developed in our inner city areas, how much commercial space is developed. So our city planners are trying to get that right. But what that does mean is that existing or the stock that is developed now that is available may not be able to be reproduced as easily. There may be more planning restrictions. Increased development costs, as the market has been quite active, as some of the development costs increase, some of the challenges of getting new product to market. So that's where existing product or product that is available may be a better pricing than some of the product that comes forward. There's competition, which is also a challenge and opportunity. So Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and Perth are competing with each other, but they're all offering something different in terms of what the market may want, and needing to have that adaptability into the area. The opportunities, Australia is growing its economic base. One of the factors that's probably not well known is that Australia is the third biggest international student market in the world after the United States and Great Britain. So there are some in excess of over 200,000 international students studying at Australian universities. That figure is forecast to grow to at least 350,000 over the next 5 years. And if the US economy tightens, become more protective, the opportunity for people to study in Australia. Our Australian universities are very highly regarded. The affordability index is good for Australian universities. The cities are safe places to live, like Singapore. Our medical technology, Australia is developing some of the best medical technology research in the world, and cities like Brisbane and Perth have invested billions of dollars into hospital. The Fiona Stanley Hospital, which was finished in Perth about 18 months ago, is a $3.2 billion world-leading research hospital. Similarly in Brisbane, the Royal Brisbane and the Mater Hospitals have both expanded their campuses by about $2 billion to become world-leading centres of biomedical research. So Australia is not just a resource nation. It has the lucky advantage of having resources, and there are minerals in the ground that are known to be there that still haven't been taken out of the ground. So that's not going to go away. Iron ore prices are kicking back, but the opportunity, our resource and our rural sectors are going to continue. Our financial sector is building as well. Sustainability is a big issue in Australia, and Australia is very much looking at how it maintains that. Design, Australia is looking to build some of the best developments in the world by leading with some of the best planning in the world and making sure that our cities are connected, that we maintain our high levels of accessibility. So as the outlook, I think that the commercial job market, mixed use, transport, incentives, jobs are going to be created in Australia. Our unemployment rate is going to stay on the longer term below that 6%, that the base, building the base of our economy is happening. We have consistent sort of government policy, and the difference in government policy between either side of politics in Australia, between either Liberal, National or the ALP, there's nuances of difference, but in terms of economic development, the general principles are largely the same. We want to develop great buildings. As I said, this is a building that is just being developed in Brisbane now, designed by Woha from Singapore. So those of you who have been to the Brisbane will see this building emerging over the next couple of years. The design across Australia is increasingly improving, creating good quality outcomes, great places, great cities for people to live. And connected. As I said, transport is really a focus, and our current Prime Minister is very focused on infrastructure investment. So light rail in Sydney, Melbourne Metro, Brisbane Metro, Perth City Link, Brisbane Cross River Rail, Sydney Metro, and add the Gold Coast link there as well. So there is infrastructure investment happening across our major cities, so we don't experience the major congestion problems that some of the cities of the world connect. So thank you, and my apologies for giving you a lot of information in a very tight time frame, but if anyone wanted to have a chat later, any questions, happy to take any questions if there's any time. Thank you very much.